It's now time to introduce our guest speaker. And he is Curtis Armstrong, whose investiture in the Baker Street Irregulars as an actor, and a rare one, is well deserved. Now, his first film appearance was as Miles Dalby in Risky Business, 1983. And he went on to star as Dudley Dawson in Revenge of the Nerds in 1984. And if you don't recall the name Dudley Dawson, it's because he was better known in the movie as Booger. His list of credits in film,
An illustrious career.
television, video games, and audio is long indeed. He's played Inspector Gregson in the audio series of Moriarty available on Audible. He's played Sherlock Holmes in Lynching last January. Before he was Sherlock Holmes. His skip was Mrs. Hudson and the Return of Sherlock Holmes. And his co-stars were Ashley Polisic, Mrs. Hudson, and Ken Ludwig as the Dubby.
Yeah! Typecasting.
Unfortunately, it was recorded, and it's available at the Red Circle website, as will be today's performance, eventually, thanks to our official videographer, Matt Hall.
Yeah!
Now, I quickly confess that I've not seen all of his non-Sherlockian performances, but I do want to track down his episode of the television series Hot in Cleveland. I was born in Cleveland long before air conditioning was invented. And I'm sure that hot is rather different from the hot. Now, I'm not the only person here from Cleveland. Michael Dirt is from Cleveland.
From Lorraine, please. Lorraine. Near Cleveland.
I'm sure. Dan Stashar has written a book about the villains and the heroes of Cleveland. So, Curtis has also played John Watson in excerpts of Conan Doyle's long-lost play, The Angels of Darkness, at a BSI conference in Salt Lake City in 2008. And you're about to see a reprise of his presentation of a B-list of canonical villains from last January's annual dinner of the BSI, with some additions. So if you've seen it before, it's better this time.
Longer anyway.
Thank you. We know their names. Moriarty, Roylott, Sebastian Moran, von Bork, Baron Adelberg Gruner are all good examples of the sort of arch-villain that Sherlock Holmes was put on this planet to track down and to vanquish one way or another. The grand sociopaths of the canon, these are the types of men who gave Holmes more long nights of restless pacing the room and scattering cigarette ends around his armchair than any other. But these marquee names, these A-listers, as we might refer to them in my line of work, were far from the only villains Holmes had to deal with. There was a B-list, too. And it is as a member in good standing of a B-list myself, though a non-criminal one, usually, that I would like to talk about this reliable but often unheralded group tonight, or today, since it's daytime. The big fish in the criminal underworld always gets a potted biography in the canon, either from Holmes himself or from one of the pale, nervous, jittery people who show up for help, like Helen Stoner or John Hector MacFarlane. Whoever does the introduction, it is on the B list that you find what Holmes himself refers to as the gudgeons, the ones who dreamed of being a criminal mastermind but who didn't possess the brains to make the top tier. Or forget about being a mastermind, the ones who just saw an opening and thought they could get away with something. These are the genuinely obscure criminals, unknown and unheralded, not because, like Moriarty, they didn't wish to be known, but because they were blundering, stupid, greedy, amoral, incompetent, and they got caught. In the Sherlock Holmes stories, it's the criminal B-list that I really enjoy. It was a golden age of lawbreakers and criminal enterprise, but you wouldn't know it by these people. Still, Holmes had his hands full. This was a man who had begun his professional career at the beginning of the 1880s, and 15 years later was still able to leaf through a self-compiled Nemesis Index and could say of it, "My collection of M's is a fine one." That is just a dozen years or so of work, and he's only talking about one letter. Moriarty is there, of course, and Sebastian Moran, the only Moriarty henchman who was given an on-screen part and lines. "You fiend! You clever, clever fiend," he hisses, as only an extravagantly mustachioed, Oxford and Eton-educated, card-sharping, tiger-hunting, syphilis-ridden, empire-loving sidekick to the ultimate Victorian big bad could hiss. And he did it in sentences without an S in them. So, by any reasonable literary standard, Moran is impressive, even if he did fall for the whole Holmes silhouette on the shade thing. Everybody, even evil geniuses, can make mistakes. And, you look at the larger picture. So, what we have left in the M's, as mentioned by Sherlock Holmes, are Morgan, Meridew, and Matthews. So let's start with them. Morgan sounds like a serious bad guy. Holmes describes him as Morgan the Poisoner, suggesting that poisoning was something Morgan went into in a professional way. Multiple poisonings, in other words, of wives, possibly, or people between him and an inheritance, or maybe poisoning was just something he did well and he kind of got off on it. To be a successful serial poisoner of people, even at a time when deadly poisons were readily available at the corner chemist, requires thought, organization, knowledge, care, dedication, and time management. It was a grown-up line of work. As for Meridew, of abominable memory, you didn't enjoy an abominable memory in the 19th century underworld without earning it. The possibilities of just what made Meridew abominable are too vast to contemplate. We simply don't have sufficient evidence. But abominable is as abominable does. And if Holmes says he's abominable, that's good enough for me. That leaves us then with Matthews, the third man mentioned in Holmes's index. He seems, on the face of it, to be a bit of an anomaly. He is neither serial killer nor abominable. What does Holmes say about him? Matthews, who knocked out my left canine in the waiting room at Charing Cross. Now, Holmes's laconic speaking style reads well on the page, but can sometimes be ambiguous as to meaning. We have to assume that when he says Charing Cross, he means the train station and not the hotel. And when he says Matthews knocked out his left canine, he means his tooth and not a dog he was walking. Actually, since he describes it as the left canine, there would have had to have been two dogs, one on the left, one on the right. But it seems less improbable the more I think about it, so let it go. Literally anyone of any class could be in a train station waiting room. That is kind of the point of train station waiting rooms. All we know about Matthews is that he committed an act of mayhem on the person of Sherlock Holmes. No other crime is mentioned. He wasn't trying to escape. No provocation for the attack is described either. Here is a thought, presented here, as far as I know, for the first time ever. Maybe Matthews was a drunken football hooligan whose team had just lost, and he was taking out his anger on the first person who looked at him funny. Now, in Matthews' case, Holmes may have just been intently observing the knees of his trousers to try to determine which way he was going to vote in the next election. It was a theory he was working on at the time, but it never went anywhere. And Matthews took offense at the scrutiny. We'll never know, but it sounds like Matthew was just a hothead who picked the wrong person to take out his aggressions on, and now he winds up in the rarefied company of Professor Moriarty and Colonel Sebastian Moran. But if so, why did Holmes put him there? Because it was a reminder of one of the rare times that Mr. Great Amateur Boxer and Baritsu Master Single Stick Expert forgot to keep his guard up. Which also explains why Watson never bothered writing it up. So, another mystery solved. But my point, and the ostensible subject of this talk, is that some of the most striking antagonists in the canon are those who have fallen into crime, essentially by mistake. The ones who slipped on the moral wet grass, as it were, and found themselves up against the greatest criminal investigation of his day, not because they had plotted and planned for years to commit the crime of the century, but because they were caught in the act of being human. Somebody who went wrong, not because he was an evil genius, but because he was weak-willed, or just a spontaneous person who was open to suggestions. That's right. The same qualities that made them fun at parties led to their ultimate undoing as criminals. Not to say that these perpetrators were good people. They weren't. They were often bad, but they weren't pros. They were a little like the metaphorical tree that Holmes mentions in The Adventure of the Empty House, the one that starts out as a nice, healthy tree and then develops some unsightly eccentricity. For every Napoleon of crime or second most dangerous man or worst man in London, there were hundreds of formerly normal citizens who found themselves developing unsightly eccentricities. Their brains started out as normal brains and have mutated into abnormal ones. And now, these people are frantically trying to extricate themselves from a crime they would never have contemplated committing in the days before they became eccentric. It seems that in the early days especially, these accidental criminals were the standard sort of case brought to Holmes, not the exception. Holmes's occasional fits of pique about the paucity of crime in London, I suspect, may have been prompted more by the failures of the professional A-list criminals who ought to know better, and not at the fact that so many of the cases brought to him were of the screw-up variety. It is worth knowing that his moments of real outrage at criminal behavior are reserved for the lowlifes, like Mr. Windibank in A Case of Identity, when Moriarty, a man of the foulest antecedents and a man guilty of God knows how many thefts and murders and kneecappings, he comes to 221B, Holmes invites him to pull up a chair and they have a civilized chat by the fireside. With Windibank, a penny ante sleazebag who tried to cheat his stepdaughter out of 50 quid a year inheritance from her Uncle Ed in Auckland by wooing her himself while disguised as somebody named Hosmer shows up? Out comes the riding crop. James Ryder from The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle was probably always a little weasel. Even at school, he just seems the type. I mean, not only does he frame an innocent John Horner, but he manages to rope in poor Catherine Cusack, the lady in waiting to the Countess of Morcar, into his confession as well. She told me where the jewel was, he whines, intimating the whole thing was her idea. But we can imagine the conversation. Ryder.
The hotel recommends our guests place any valuables in our safe. I don't suppose the Countess has anything of great value she would like us to put away.
Catherine.
Oh, no thanks. She likes to keep her precious little carbuncle in this box. Can you imagine? It's locked, though, so no worries.
You see? Throwaway remark, not anything criminal at all. She probably was just wishing this pest would leave her alone so she could get on with her unpacking, and now there's all this. I mean, she probably didn't even remember the conversation afterwards. She was so accustomed to getting hit on by sleazy hotel managers that she barely even noticed it anymore. As for Ryder, getting the brush off from attractive ladies' maids was practically a daily event. He was one of those sweaty palm, gelatinous geezers with brown teeth and a bad beaver who couldn't get a date on his best day, and now he's going to show everybody by becoming a suave international jewel thief who looks great in evening wear. Except he's such an idiot that after going through all the trouble of lifting the carbuncle and framing someone else for the crime, he panics and shoves the jewel into a bar-tailed goose, which he then confuses for a different bar-tailed goose. I ask you, in a similar category, although technically an actual professional criminal, is a character who shows up later in Holmes's career in nobody's favorite case, the Mazarin Stone. Count Negretto Silvius. Here is another dreamer who probably from puberty was imagining himself as a future star on the global criminal stage. At grammar school, the boys made fun of his nose, which he hadn't grown into yet. And that was it. He never looked back. Where to begin? He started with his name. Now, honestly, I have no idea what his original name was, but there is no way it was Negretto Silvius. No parent saddles an infant with a name like Negretto, even if he had a rich uncle with that name. Whatever the name was, he probably thought it didn't sound master criminally enough, so he changed it. It took forever, this name change. He agonized over it. It had to be perfect. But what he came up with was a name that was so improbable, people didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And then he tacks a count on it for good measure. He'd have to spell it out for people he was meeting for the first time. And when checking into hotels, he would always get asked for picture ID. He'd get incensed and say, "It's Italian!" And the desk clerks would say, "Don't sound Italian to me, mate. Silvius?" Only a criminal not operating on all cylinders would change his name to something that stood out even more than his original name, whatever that was. His overall appearance and sartorial choices didn't help matters. Watson describes him as a sportsman and a famous game shot. Now, both Baring Gould and Klinger discreetly pass over this weird nomenclature, but what the hell is a famous game shot? Does he mean big game hunter? Why not say so? This just sounds like something Chico Marx would say. I would like to imagine when he handed people his business card, it read Count Negretto Silvius, famous game shot. He was well dressed, we're told, but, quote, his brilliant necktie, shining pin, and glittering rings were flamboyant in their effect. Doubtless. Why not just walk around with a placard reading, cheap hoodlum and violent criminal, please arrest me? Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, there are idiots in every profession. It's unfair to tar an entire industry, even a criminal one, with the same brush. Fair enough. But for every efficient organization like Moriarty's, or even, in a pinch, the Red Circle, there was a bumbling cut-rate, we try harder group who barely gets any attention at all. And I'm going to close with my favorite, the one that appears in The Three Gables, the Spencer-John Gang. Or as I like to think of them, the Spencer-John Gang featuring Barney Stockdale and friends. Now, what was this mysterious gang of London malefactors, this organization that spread its tentacles throughout darkest Harrow Weald, whose name sounds like nothing so much as a mid-60s white blues band from South London? Forget Moriarty's monk-like empire. This is the one we need to know more about. Of Spencer John, the big boss, we know nothing. He clearly fancies himself a Moriarty type, remaining in the shadows while his underlings carry out his orders. I suspect he may even have worked at one time for Moriarty, though clearly not in a very high position. Someone way down the totem pole. T-boy, we'll say. He'd come around rattling his card at 10 in the morning, again at 4 maybe, knocking on doors saying, "Cup of tea, Mr. Porlock. Maybe a nice scone." That kind of thing. For years he did that, while discreetly learning the business, picking up some intimidation tips from Sam Brewer when he was part of the organization, before Sam went to work for Negretto Silvius. Maybe taking Jew's harp lessons from Mr. Parker, the garroter down the hall. After a while, for whatever reason, maybe oversteeping the tea one too many times, or serving tarts with soggy bottoms, he was let go. It was then that he decided to start his own company. He was able to persuade a few friends of his to join him, friends who were just stupid enough to do it, like Milford, the bun boy, or Jojo, who watered the office ficus and generally kept the place tidy. That's probably how the Spencer-John gang was configured in the early days. Spencer John, in preparation for his new job as Moriarty-like mastermind, would spend hours sitting entirely motionless, like a spider, in the center of its web. He was practicing. He told people it was yoga, and he was trying to get his resting heart rate down to 28 beats a minute. But it was really because Moriarty did it, and he thought there must be something in it. Moriarty's web, of course, had 1,000 radiations, but Spencer's had, like, none, really. He figured they'd come eventually, but they never did. It was only later, when he acquired Barney Stockdale, Susan, and Steve Dixie in a hostile takeover of an even more incompetent gang, that Spencer's outfit really started to gain traction. Almost immediately, he started referring to Barney as his brain trust, which should have tipped people off to the fact that there was a problem. Barney had virtually no talent in the criminal line at all, but he was great company, especially after a couple of pints. He claimed to have the greatest collection of jokes in the business, all of which he had stolen from funnier criminals. He had one for every occasion. A few examples. Servant: "Madam, your husband has eloped with the cook." Wife: "Good, now I'll have the maid to myself once in a while." Or, "There's this man at Camberwell, so fat, they grease omnibus wheels with his shadow." Okay, you had to be there for that one. Or, "Who is the greatest chicken killer in Shakespeare?" Macbeth, "Because he did murder most foul." Yeah. Classics. But the drawback to having Barney around was he insisted that he have his wife Susan too. Now, Susan was a part-time hood at first, mainly making coffee, that kind of thing. They called her Wheezy because of her breathing, but never to her face because she had a temper and was big-boned. Spencer had a kind of old-fashioned thing about women criminals. He thought this line of work wasn't made for the delicately nurtured. But as everyone pointed out, Susan was far from delicately nurtured. It was she who introduced brass knuckles to the gang when for years Spencer John had said they just didn't have the money in the budget for them and they'd have to stick to the old tried and true life preservers. But at a gang meeting, she demonstrated their effectiveness on her husband Barney, who hadn't realized what he was volunteering for. And the damage she did to him was so impressive, Spencer decided he could move some money around and they'd get brass knuckles. As a result, Spencer hired her full time, but paid her 75 pence for every pound he paid the men in the gang for doing the same jobs. And when she found out, she struck for £1.10 and got it. Rounding out the inner circle was Steve Dixie, the bruiser. Now, much has been written about Watson's atrociously and uncharacteristically racist depiction of Steve Dixie. But what Watson didn't know was that Steve Dixie had started out as an actor in America with a promising future before falling into bad company, as actors will, and turning to a life of crime. The Steve Dixie character was one he had written. He had created this for himself and had played it to great acclaim in comedies and on stage and vaudeville. But after he made the States too hot to hold him, he fled to London and he discovered that the English criminals didn't get the joke. And they found him incredibly intimidating, so he adopted the bruiser character as a business necessity. Now, I expect that Holmes knew him from his stage days and had more than once used him in criminal investigations. The scenes with Watson in The Three Gables were actually coded performances designed to deliver valuable secret information without revealing their professional relationship to the good doctor. And what was the secret information Steve Dixie was passing on to Holmes in this complicated way? Why not just pass it along in a coded telegram? I don't know. Maybe Steve Dixie and Holmes just enjoyed the drama of the thing. Neither of them acted much anymore. These little improv exercises kept them sharp. Now, if some of you think I have made up this theory out of whole cloth, it's because I have. I felt I had to do something to explain Steve Dixie's presence in the canon, and this is as good as any. You're welcome. Thank you. When it came to the criminal industrial complex of Holmes's day, not unlike our own. It seems there really was room for everyone. At one end, you had the men at the top. The people at a criminal game seldom, if ever, equaled. The ones whose single appearance is enough to claim an indelible place in the canon. These are the criminals to delight in spite of ourselves. The brilliant, the chilling, the unforgettable, the foes worthy of the great detective's steel. And then there's this lot, the uninspired, the unimaginative, the stupid. Sad to say, the bread and butter jobs Sherlock Holmes only took to pay the rent. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the B list. Thank you, and thank you.